Okay, this presentation is on using Blazor to manage data in SQL Server and Microsoft Fabric. My name is Michael Washington, and I am a Microsoft MVP. I've written numerous books over the years. Some of them are listed here, but primarily my books for the past 5 years have been on Blazor. So here's the agenda. Um, First, I'm going to talk very briefly about forms over data. And I'm going to introduce using a Blazor data sheet that will allow you to create applications um, using this data sheet, which is basically like Excel, but inside a web browser, rather than creating forms uh, for applications like we normally would. I'll first cover using this, it's a free open source project. I'll first cover it using SQL Server. But then the last half of this, actually the three-fourths of this, will actually be about Fabric. So it'll be covering first how to connect to Fabric using T-SQL, which is something that many people may not be used to. However, it's required if you want to make applications that use Fabric as a data source. So we'll start from the beginning. We'll show exactly how to connect, all the various settings that you need to do. We'll then cover importing data into Fabric using Parquet files. Now, this is important because while you can query Fabric easily using T-SQL, when it comes to putting data into Fabric, T-SQL is extremely slow. Therefore, the method that I use with my various projects is to use Parquet files to programmatically create the Parquet files using C# and then putting those Parquet files in Azure Storage and then using Select Into to rapidly import the data into Fabric. In my normal day job, we're able to move about 2 million rows of data within seconds at a time. We can move about 60 million rows of data in about an hour. So this is a way to rapidly get data into Fabric, and that's what we'll be covering. Also, I'll then finish up with showing how to use the Blazor datasheet, which I'm going to introduce in a few moments, specifically how to use it in Fabric, where the data import is using Parquet files. Time permitting, I will cover creating reports using Blazor, including a couple of key important things if you're using Fabric as your data source with Blazor um, delivered Power BI embedded reports. Don't worry, when we get to that, I'll make it clear. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. So first, forms over data. If you're creating business applications like I have been doing for actually decades now, creating forms is the thing that really takes the most time. Um, So basically here, I'm just basically saying how, it's often the most time consuming and costly parts of building the application, when in the end, all the customer wants to do is just basically see data and update data and delete data. So if we can come up with a way where we don't have to create these time consuming forms, if we just present the data to them in a way, then that is kind of what we're exploring here in this presentation. So I'm basically showing how to use the Blazor datasheet. Again, this is an open source project. It's actually not created by myself. It's something I found. Um, and it's pretty amazing. It also does provide custom validation so that, you can, you know, um, enforce business rules and that sort of thing. We won't have time to really get deep into it. However, I just want you to know that that is possible, and that's what really makes this pretty exciting, in my opinion. So first, let's look at the Blazor data sheet with SQL Server. So here, I'm kind of showing you what it looks like. There's a toolbar at the top, and and that's actually custom code, and I'm going to show you all the code on how I created the toolbar. It's actually quite simple. But pay attention to the grid at the bottom there. Basically, it's like Microsoft Excel. And you'll see there's grayed out, the first column's grayed out, and that's because that's a primary key, so the person can't edit it. So that's not editable. However, the other fields are editable. Just like Excel, you just click on the field, you make a change, and then like number 2 there, you click Save. So let's take a quick look at the application. Now, again, you can download the application on GitHub. Um, the links at the end, the website at the end will take you to all the various links. But basically, it's at blazerdata.net. So just go ahead and download it. And when you run it, you navigate to the data editor node. You click the little gear icon to make a database connection, and you just connect to any SQL database that can be reached by the application. Then the table dropdown will show. So it's basically showing you all the tables that are in that database. So you just select a table, and then the data from the table will display. At that point, you can just make a change, hit save, and it's pretty much that simple. Something to note, if the table does not have a primary key, the saving will be disabled. You can insert rows, just go ahead and click the insert button, type in the new information. Notice how that first column, because it's a primary key, is not something that you would edit. And then you just go ahead and click save. And you'll see the save icon. If there's any errors, for example, you know, there's a field that cannot be null, but you left it null, or you put in data that's not correct, then of course you would see the errors. However, the rows that work fine, they would go ahead and save. And of course, you can also delete rows. You click the delete button, the row's deleted, and then of course you do have to still click save to persist that change. There's the validators there. So as you see here, in this one field, that's an integer field. However, I put in the letter A, which of course is not an integer. So what happens is that it turns red. So it just kind of shows you how the validation is pretty straightforward. That where you see red, well, that's an error, and the person should just clear up all the parts that are red. You can make it so that these validation errors can be enforced, or they could just be informational. Now let's take a look at the code. So again, there's a couple of sections here. However, I just want to call some things out. So this database connection here, this is just for the screens that allow you to get a connection to the data source. This load data section here, something to look at here is that first, I'm getting the tables in the database, and that's for the dropdown. Once a table is selected, this load table data is called, and we're going to get into the details in a moment. And that actually calls this load table headers and data, which for the table that's selected, we need to know, what columns are there, because we have to then build the data sheet, and then of course to display the data. Once someone clicks the save button, this method is called, and then that method calls these 4 methods, which is to basically process the updated rows, process the inserted rows, and then process the deleted rows. There's a couple of helper methods, things like how do I get the primary keys in the selected table, because I need those primary keys when doing the inserts and updates. Determining what columns are computed columns, because a computed column is not displayed because, again, it's a computed column, so it's not something that you can actually put data into. So there's just a bunch of helper methods. And then, of course, I have this one validator, custom validator, where I, based upon the length, if you're typing something that's too long, it basically, turns red to basically go, hey, there's too much data here. So that's kind of an overview of the code. Here is another look at the code. So everything under the data editor folder is part of this solution. Most of those files there are just the pop-up dialogues. So let's take a look first at the toolbar. So this is the code, and it's very simple. Basically, we're using material icons to basically display the icon, and then when you click on the button, there's of course a save button, um, and then there's the drop down. This is the drop down for the tables. Something else to note is, and that this comes with the control, there's an undo and a redo. So this is pretty powerful. So you can make a bunch of changes and you can then click the buttons to undo and redo, and that's just automatically built into to the control. And then of course we have the insert row and we have the delete row. Now let's look at the data grid itself. So this part, pay attention to, because this obviously is something that I'm introducing you to, because a lot of you may want to use this in your own applications. So what is required to have this data grid that does all this stuff? This is the markup right here. So what you do is, you install the NuGet package, which allows this data sheet to work. There's a number of settings here for, whether or not you show the headings and can people add rows or insert rows. But then essentially you just bind the data to datasheet right here. There's also quite a bit of customization and commands, but this is pretty much it. So you drop this on there, you put some bind some data to datasheet, and boom, you've got that functionality. So let's kind of go through the steps on what was required to, for example, load the data. So here, I first retrieve the table metadata, and then I fetch and filter the column details. I then build a SQL query to actually pull in the data, and then I execute that query to actually get the data, and I pull it into a data table. And this is important because it's the data tables. The data goes into the data tables or comes out of the data tables before inserting into SQL Server. One other important thing is that I add a ID column, and it's just basically an auto number column. And that's because I need to have every row identified with just a single key, so that I know when rows have been added and deleted, and also when retrieving rows to do updates, I need to add that column there. Now, once the data is loaded, then I want to load it into the data sheet. Well, once it's retrieved from SQL Server, now I want to load it into that data sheet. So these are the pretty much what the flow is like. So first, I new up a sheet. I then hide that ID column, but it's going to be there because I need to refer to it programmatically. I then set the column headers and types, because some of the columns, for example, computed columns, I'm actually not going to display in the sheet. Then I load the data into the sheet, and then I wire up event handlers. Now this one's very important, because every time a cell is changed, this method is called. And what I do is I record in a collection the ID of that cell. The reason why this is important is that this control, I've loaded up 500,000 rows at a time, and the control handles it using virtualization. It handles it just fine. So imagine a person loads up, there's 500,000 rows, they're able to scroll through, it's moving just like Excel, no problem. They update, say, row number 20,000, 400,000, and 410. When they hit the save button, we don't want to save all 500,000 rows. We only want to save those 3 that were edited. So that's why that event handler that detects cell changes, that allows me to create a collection, so I only know that these three rows were edited. That way, when I actually do the update to the database, I only update those 3 rows. So again, when the person clicks the save button, this is the flow, which is we first process updated rows, we then process inserted rows, and then we process deleted rows. Something to note here. This right here is a SQL Server version. When we do the Blazor the Fabric version, we actually will do the deleted rows first, and then we'll handle the insert rows and the updated rows together. And that's because the method that we use to update Fabric is different than with SQL Server. So because of that, the way we process it is actually different. But again, I'll explain everything. It'll be clear. So updating the data. Here I kind of go into the details, but the only thing I really want to call out here is that um, as I loop through the rows that were changed, okay, so we're only going to look at the change rows. Um, what happens is that I do a select on that ID to get that data, and then I build up an SQL statement. And this SQL statement is a parameterized SQL statement. Now, parameterized SQL statements are good just on a safety reason. However, sometimes the data has apostrophes and that sort of thing. So you'll find that using parameterized queries is actually a must. It's not something that, oh, it's nice to have. You're gonna Your data updates are not going to work if you don't do that. I had a dev who actually was like, in this one case, do I really need to do it? I was like, yeah, go ahead and try it, whatever. And he found out that, whoa, no, it just blows up. So again, I've done the hard work of creating methods that create the parameterized queries, so you can just go ahead and just use the code I've given you. You don't have to, spend a week creating the code like I actually had to. Continuing with the update, what happens is when you do updates, you need to do it on the primary keys. So that's why I had to have code to detect those primary keys. So it used those primary keys, of course, to carefully build the where clauses. So again, all this is pretty much boilerplate. You can just go ahead and reuse this code that I've given you, and it should work fine for your case. Adding data, again, the only thing to really call out here is that I know a row's been added when its ID is actually null. So when someone adds a row into the data sheet, that ID field, that hidden field, will actually be null. That's how I know it's new. So I go ahead and grab that and add it to the database. Again, the same thing about creating the parameterized queries. And deleting data is, of course, the opposite of adding, which is um, when the data is first loaded, we load everything into a data table called the original data table. When a person's editing it and they hit the save button, we create another data table. So now we have two data tables. So we then look at the two data tables to see which row is not in, which was in the original one, but not in the new one. And then we know that that one is being deleted, and therefore we get the ID, and then we, actually delete it from the database. Okay, so enough of the SQL stuff. The rest of this presentation is now about Fabric. So using the Fabric warehouse. I just have one slide on Fabric in case someone's coming here and they're not familiar with Fabric. I'm sure actually everyone who's part of this um, event actually knows all about Fabric. But for those who are new to Fabric, it's an end-to-end analytics and data platform designed to unify various data-related tasks into a single cohesive solution. It's actually a number of components from Power BI, Azure Synapse Analytics, Azure Data Factory. It provides real-time analytics as well as, of course, data warehousing. And data warehousing is the only thing that I'm actually covering. I'm actually not covering lake houses. Okay, so that's my one slide on Fabric. Now, again, we're first going to talk about connecting to Fabric using T-SQL. We're then going to cover importing into Fabric using Parquet files. And then finally, we will come back to using the data grid, but this time specifically how it's used with Fabric. So we want to connect to Fabric through T-SQL. And to demonstrate this, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through all the steps, 100% of the steps that are required to allow you to connect to your Fabric data warehouse using the Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio. This is exactly what's required if you want to connect to Fabric using in our example, I'll be showing how to connect using Blazor or any sort of program where the end user themselves aren't logging into the Fabric data. Your application is logging into the Fabric data. Okay, so here's the steps. First, you're going to want to go to your Azure, portal.azure.com, and log in. You're going to want to navigate to the Microsoft Entra ID node, and you're going to want to select App Registrations. You're going to want to click New Registration. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a thing called Service Principal. So it's not really a user, it's basically an application registration. However, this application registration will be treated like a user. They'll have a username, which will be the client or the object ID. And they'll even have a password, which will be the secret. And I'm going to show you how we do that. And that's what's going to be used to log into Fabric through the TSQL endpoint. So the first thing you do is you give it a name. And this name, in this case, we're calling it Fabric Data User. This name will be used when providing setting the security in the Fabric website. So you can just go ahead and click accounts in this organization only and go ahead and click register. You don't have to click anything else. There's some other options, but just these three things, that's all you need. Now you'll see where it says application client ID. That is the username. So you're going to want to copy that down. I know it's this long GUID, but that's how it is. So the username is not Fabric Data User. That's only used for setting, configuring the security. But when logging in through the TSQL endpoint, that application client ID, that is the username. Next, you're going to need to give it a password. So we'll go to Certificates and Secrets. We'll click New Client Secret, and we'll go ahead and give it a secret. So value, that's the value. You're going to want to click that little button to copy it. Save that. That is going to be the password. So we now have the username and the password. Okay, so now let's go to the Fabric portal. And let's click the gear icon and navigate to the admin portal. And you're going to need to navigate to tenant settings and developer settings. And you're going to want to make sure that under the section Service Principals can use Fabric APIs, you're going to want to make sure that that's turned on. By default, it's not turned on. If it's not turned on, this will not work. Okay, so you have to turn that on. Next, create or go into any workspace. Now notice it cannot be a personal workspace, so it has to be a normal organization workspace, but you navigate to that workspace, and then you click the Manage Access. And then you click on Add People or Groups. Now normally you would type in, someone from your organization. However, in this case, you're going to type in that name, Fabric Data User, or whatever name you had. You're going to type that in, and you're going to make sure you set the security to admin. It has to be admin level. And then you click Add. Note that what happens is that you've given access to this workspace. So therefore, all the objects in this workspace, you're now given this access to all the objects. So in this case, you see I have a data warehouse, I have a lake house, I also have some paginated reports in there. Right now, all I care about is the warehouse, but I do want you to know that security applies to everything in this workspace. So I'm going to go ahead and go into my warehouse. So you select the warehouse, and then I click the gear icon that's in the warehouse. And then the name, that is going to be the name of the database. So you want to note that. And then at the bottom there under SQL connection string, that is the connection string. So at this point, we have everything we need to connect. So let's go ahead and get the Microsoft SQL Management Studio. Of course, you can download this free. But I've downloaded it, I've turned it on. So now I'm going to select Database Engine, and I'm now going to put all my settings in. And the setting that's the most important thing here is you see under Authentication, you have to select Microsoft Entra Service Principal. If you don't see that option, you just need to update your Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio to the latest version. As far as the server name, you just put in what you got from the connection screen in that last step. For the username, I told you what your username was. That was that GUID. For your password, that was that password secret. Make sure you check Trust Server Certificate, and then go ahead and click Connect. And you'll be in there. This right here is the way that I actually interact with Fabric on a daily basis. This is way faster than using the website. So if this is not something that you're using, this might be something you want to consider, but this is really the only way I really interact with Fabric. Now, let's talk about how you can use this to connect using your applications. For example, in this case, Microsoft Blazor. So again, I have a GitHub project and I have the links at blazordata.net. It's called Fabric Data Explorer. So the rest of this presentation, we'll be looking at this code. This code was created specifically for this presentation. There's two parts to it. There is import data, which we'll be covering in the next step, and of course, the data sheet, which is the same data sheet I showed you before, but this time it's connecting to Fabric. However, right now, I just want to show you the code that is used to connect to Fabric using the settings that I just showed you. So the first thing is that you're going to need to actually install the Microsoft Data SQL Client NuGet package. So this is actually all that's required. However, these other two NuGet packages are also required because as soon as you try to do queries, you're going to start getting errors. And the reason why you're getting the errors is there's basically extra types, hierarchy that if they're part of the data, but you don't have reference to these additional libraries, then you're going to get errors. So just take my advice, install these three NuGet packages. The next thing is that you're going to need, of course, the database name, the server name. Integrated security is actually not used here, as this class is being reused from the SQL Server version. But you need the database name, the server name, the username, and the password. Those four things are needed. So I just have a class. I recommend using this class to just set those values to the class. Then I recommend reusing this method, and basically you just pass that class in as a parameter. And what this code does is it carefully constructs the connection string and just returns the connection string here. The key thing here is that the authentication has to be set as Active Directory Service Principal. So this is the part that's the important part. The rest of this is pretty much boilerplate, and you probably already know how to, select it. And of course, things like the service certificate being true is also important. So again, I just recommend reusing my code because it will work. Now that you have a connection string, you can just use the normal SQL connection object and you pass that connection string in, and then everything just works. So in this case, I have that connection, and then I use that connection to say get schema, and I'm saying, get the tables, and this is how I, get a list of all the tables that are at that connection, basically that database. But then any other SQL commands that are supported by Fabric can then can work. So basically, it's pretty much that simple. Okay, so now let's talk about importing data using Parquet files. So this method is going to be used again as part of the data sheet. However, I made this one page that just concentrates on importing data so that you can fully understand how this method works and how it works with C#. Because I do know that there are a lot of pipelines and various notebooks that people show how to create the Parquet files and how to do essentially what I'm about to show. However, I was not able to find any clear examples using C#. So that's what motivated me to create these examples, and what also motivated me to speak at this event. So this application, when you run it, and you click on the import data tab, as you see here, it requires you to set three different things: a database connection, so connect to any SQL data source; a Fabric connection, using, of course, the connections that the method I just showed you; and then also an Azure storage. And that's because we have to put the Parquet file in Azure storage, and then from there we imported in the data into Fabric. So once all three of these are set, the table drop-down will appear, and you'll just select a table, and this table is being selected from the SQL database connection. And then you just click Import Data. And what it does is it just takes all the data that's in that table and pushes it into Fabric. Again, it's able to move about the most amount of data that I'm able to push into Fabric at one time is about, like I said, about 2 million rows. Anything more than that, and the select into statement will sometimes time out. So I always batch everything into 2 million rows at a time. When selecting from SQL Server, depending upon how fast the SQL Server database moves, I found that pulling, say, more than 250,000 to 500,000 rows of data, if I try to pull more than that, the SQL Server will time out. So what I do for my big jobs is I only pull out the data out of SQL Server, about 200,000 rows at a time. And then with the Parquet files, I only do 2 million rows at a time, and I just loop that over and over and over again. So that's why I get about 60 million rows an hour with most of my jobs. Okay, first, I just want to have a quick slide, actually 2 slides, about why don't I just use the built-in methods that Microsoft provides. So Microsoft provides, 2 standard ways, which is data pipelines and data flows. Data pipelines, you know, you can do a lot, right? And a lot of people use them. Whereas with the data flows, they're simpler, not as powerful as the data pipelines, but they both work together. Here's the problem. Okay, so number one problem. When something goes wrong, you're stuck. So again, I have situations where, like I said, I have to move hundreds of millions of rows a day. And my pipeline or my data flow, it's working or whatever, but then I'll get an error. And whenever there's an error, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to examine the logs. And you're looking at the logs, but the logs do not have all the information you need. Sometimes they do, but most of the time, in my cases, they just didn't. I need step-by-step debugging, and C# allows me to step-by-step and examine, oh, that's what the data looks like. So that's it. And like this, I just got stuck. The other thing is actually not very fast. Again, I am moving massive amounts of data. And the method I'm about to show you, this is about as fast as it gets, and it is pretty gosh darn fast. The last thing the problem I have with the built-in Microsoft method is that it's actually hard to learn and understand. There are some very simplistic things where you go click, 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 boom, 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 and it works. You're like, wow, this is actually easy. Yeah, until you need to transform the data. Can it do it? Yes, it can. How it does it, you get into it. The worst part, though, is even when you get it working, complex solutions created by others, and sometimes yourself, if you come back to it, a couple of weeks later, it requires so much clicking and drilling down that it's really hard to understand. So it's very much like the Microsoft SSIS jobs, which I've been using since the mid 90s. Yeah, it works, but if you look at someone else's solution, you're clicking and it's hard to see. There's no overview or whatever. Whereas with the solutions that I've been showing you, and of course, when you download my GitHub code and you look at it, everything is sitting right there. You can even take all the code, paste it into ChatGPT and say, explain this to me as if I'm a 5-year-old, and it will just clearly explain it. So it's easy to understand. So again, this is why I'm not using the traditional Microsoft tools when moving data with my solutions. So how does this whole import to Fabric using Parquet files work? Basically, you create a Parquet file from the data, you import the Parquet file into Azure Storage, and then you use copy into to import that Parquet file, that data from the Parquet file into Fabric. One more time. So create the Parquet file. Parquet is the native format of Fabric, actually Delta. which is Parquet plus the delta changes. However, in this case, we're not just taking the Parquet file and then boom, putting it into the Fabric, storage. We're just using Parquet as a format for transferring the data because Parquet compresses data very tightly. Therefore, you can move the files fast with not a lot of latency. And when you do select into and the source is Parquet, then the Fabric's Spark engine just immediately goes, oh, I got this, and it just imports it extremely fast. We put that Parquet file into Azure Storage, and then, like I said, we do the copy into. However, for that copy into to work, because it's being executed from using a TSQL statement, if the Parquet file is not put into a public Azure storage, of course, you would not want to put your company data into public Azure storage. You have to create what we call an SAS token, and that SAS token is used in the TSQL statement to actually import the Parquet file. And I'll actually show you the exact code that's done. Okay, so let's first look at the application from, say, the end users, and then we'll look at the code. So the user just comes to the import data. They then click the database connection, and they connect to any SQL data source. Again, you could import from text files and that sort of thing, but in this example, I just say connect to a SQL data source. Then you click on the Fabric connection. You put in the settings, again, the exact same settings I just showed you how to get. And then finally, you just put in connections to any Azure storage. And again, we're assuming it's not a public Azure storage, which is why you need to use an account key. Once those three things are set, you'll see the tables from the database connection, and you just select a table, and then you click import data. It'll say processing. It'll take less than a minute, and the reason why it even takes that long is I have a lot of delays for each step because I want to make sure that each step has a chance to complete itself. But again, you should be able to import say 100,000 rows in less than a minute easily. And then it'll say it's imported. So now if you go ahead and you go into the Fabric website, you'll see the data is right there. If you open it up using the SQL Server Management Studio, you'll see the data is right there. So it just shows you how this is a method for getting data fast into Fabric. Let's take a quick look at the code. So when you click that Import Data button, what's happening here is that it's basically using that database connection, not the Fabric, this is SQL Server, and it's basically getting all the columns and it's adding them to a collection so that it can show the tables in a dropdown. Something that's a key important thing here is that we, when importing the data into Fabric, I always like to have the first field to be an auto number field, essentially. So using this tsql command, select row number over order by null as ID, this causes, as it's selecting the data, to automatically create an auto number field. This is also important because later on, when we do the data grid, the data grid will actually use that as its primary key. Then I created this import SQL into Fabric class, and this is meant to be reusable. So you just simply, the SQL query, that's wherever I'm getting my data. This course could even be a view, the table name, your Fabric connection string, your database connection string, your storage account with its container name and account key, and then you just call import data. So this is meant to be reusable by you. However, let's go ahead and take a look at and see what's going on inside it. So inside it, what it does is it basically looks at the query, figures out what fields are in the query, and builds up a Parquet file. It then adds the data to the Parquet file by executing the query and then reading the data and then adding it to the Parquet file row by row. Then it writes it to the Parquet file to a memory stream, and then basically pushes it to a Parquet file to Azure Storage. Next, it uses this method to get an SAS token. So for 1 hour, we're going to create a token that will allow us to get to that Parquet file that's in Azure Storage. And then it's going to generate this SQL script, which is basically that copy into the table name in Fabric. Basically, this with statement is saying the input is a Parquet file, and this is my shared access token. And this script, when executed, will just import the data. And like I said, the Parquet file could have 2 million rows, and it still takes about 10 seconds. This one part here takes about 10 seconds for 2 million rows, no problem. And this right here actually executes that script. And that's it. So hopefully at this point, you have grasped what it takes to import data quickly into Fabric using Parquet. So now we're going to look at that Blazor datasheet again, but this time it's in relationship to using all that exact same functionality, but this time against a Fabric data source. So the steps are a little bit different this time. This time there's like a fourth step, and that's actually, well, so the first step is we're going to delete the rows. So when the person hits save, we're going to delete rows that have been removed or updated. And we're going to use just T-SQL. So let's make a T-SQL command against Fabric to delete the rows. Not a problem. That's fast and it's no big deal. But then we're going to create a Parquet file where any new rows are added to the Parquet file, and then any updated rows are added to the Parquet file. So let's actually move back to step one again. So in step one, we're not just going to remove any rows that we detected were deleted from the data sheet. We're also going to delete any rows that have been updated. So therefore, the new values of the updated row are added in this step here. And then the other two parts are exactly the code that I already showed you. So this is really, these first two parts here, this is the only real change. So again, this kind of gives you more detail. We delete rows that have been removed or updated. We create the Parquet file from the data. We import that Parquet file to Azure Storage, and then we use copy into to import the Parquet file into Fabric. So let's look at what the application looks for the end user. So in this case, all they have to do is set a Fabric connection and an Azure Storage connection. And it does some processing, and then boom, it's going to display the tables. However, this time the tables are not coming from a SQL Server. These are the tables that are in your Fabric warehouse. So you select the table, the data will show down here, and you just make the changes to the data, and then just hit save. So it's kind of showing you, select the table, the data shows, I can make a change, I hit save. It says the data's been saved. Again, it takes about I say about 15 to 20 seconds for the save to happen because it does have to do that, creating the Parquet file and that sort of thing. However, it takes the same amount of time no matter how much data you change. So you could change, 10,000 records and it'll still take about, 20 seconds. You could change one record. It'll still take about 20 seconds. So again, it's workable. Again, if I go to the Fabric Warehouse, the change is there. And if I open up the SQL Server Enterprise Manager Studio, it's there. Let's take a quick look at the code. Again, for time, I'm not going to go too deep, but it pretty much looks like the other one with the database connection, the load data sections, the save data, and that sort of thing. Let's look at the change, though, between the SQL Server version. So when you click the Save button, this is what was changed. This time, we delete rows first, because remember, we have to delete rows that have been truly deleted, but also rows that have been updated. Then
we process the inserted rows, but we don't actually, call an insert statement into Fabric the way we would with SQL Server. We just build uh, a data table that will later be turned into a Parquet file. And then for the updated rows, we build those into a data table. So the data table consists of the inserted rows and the updated rows, and this is what's then turned into the Parquet file, which is then um, put into Azure Storage, which is then put into Fabric. Again, this right here is showing you um, the same flow as before. The only difference here is that I have a class called import data table into Fabric. It's just like the other one, whereas most of these parameters are the same. The big difference between this one and the SQL Server one is that the SQL Server one would delete the table in Fabric if it already existed, and it would then, import the data because we're always doing the entire table at one time. With this one, because I may only have deleted, say, 2 or 3 rows, and I'm only inserting a Parquet file which contains, say, 2 or 3 rows. It's just appending to the selected table. It's not dropping it or anything first. So that's why there's a difference there. Also, it's getting all the data it needs through a data table, whereas the other one, there was actually a SQL Server, an SQL command that was being passed to it, and it was having to do the select itself. So there's a difference there, but the point is this is meant to be reusable by you. Here again, it kind of goes through some of the details, but at this point, the details are pretty much the same. Creating the Parquet file, uploading it to Azure Storage, creating the SAS token, and then just creating the script to do copy into Fabric, and then executing that, and then you're done. Okay, so to finish up here, I just want to cover doing reporting using Power BI in Blazor, and this is what we call embedded reports. And I'm going to finish off where I'm going to tell you some specific things on how to make this work with Fabric, because out of the box, this works great with a SQL Server data source. However, I found when I tried to make it work with Fabric that it did not work with Fabric. So I'll cover on what to do to make it work. However, a lot of you may not be aware of this at all, so I just wanted to kind of show how this works. So if you're ever looking at a report in Power BI, and again, I use Power BI with Fabric, so it's all one big Fabric thing. On the URL, you can see after groups, that's your workspace ID. And after reports, that's your report ID. These are the two things you need to identify any report. Okay, so the report ID is not good enough. You have to have the workspace ID and the report ID. Okay, so you go into portal.azure.com. You actually click on Microsoft Entra ID. This screenshot's a little old, back when it was called Azure Active Directory, but now that number 1 there, it now says Microsoft Entra. However, the rest of it's all the same. So you go to Entra, and you go to Overview, and you grab your tenant ID number, because you're going to need that. You then go to app registrations, new registrations. This is, again, exactly the same steps that we did previously for the Fabric service principal. However, this one is going to be different because there's certain permissions that need to be assigned, whereas the other one, we just created the service principal, we didn't have to assign any permissions, and it worked. So here, you'll give it a name. The name's not really that important. Same settings as before. Click register. You grab the application client ID, because again, you'll need it later. And you, of course, make a secret like you did before, and make sure you copy it and save it because you're going to need it later. However, we're going to do 2 more things. Here, we're going to put this in a group, and
we're going to create a new group, a security group called Power BI Service Principals. We're going to add this to that group and go ahead and create. So now it's in the group. And then we're going to go into the admin portal. Like we did before, we're going to go to tenant settings, developer settings, and we're going to make sure it says allow service principals. But in this case, it's not Fabric, it's Power BI API. So make sure that's enabled. And the reason why we have put it into a group is because you can say specific security groups, and then that group that we have put that service principal in, you could just specify that group. So it gives you an extra layer of security. Then you go into workspace access, kind of like we did, well, exactly like we did with the Fabric, and you go ahead and add that service principal by name and make sure, again, it's an administrator. So at this point, to make an application, in this case, a Blazor application, we'll create a new Blazor application. We'll go to Manage NuGet Packages, and we'll install these two packages. And then we get the Power BI min.js, and we get this from GitHub. You just do a Google search. There's a GitHub Power BI project, and this file is available there. Or you can just copy it from my sample downloads, and you put that in the project. And then in the AppRaiser page, you make a reference to that JS file. And then you also put in this script. And this is just boilerplate script. And basically, we're going to call a show report where we pass in a report container, which is the container on the page. We pass in an access token. I'll show you how to get it. An embed URL. I'll show you how to get it. And a report ID. I'll show you how to get it. And this right here will then display the Power BI report. Just check my time here. Okay, we're almost done here. Then I'll make a JavaScript interop file, which basically allows me to pass all those parameters to that show report method. And then in the page itself, I have my using statements. I then have my div, and that's where the Power BI report will show. I have all my settings I need. That tenant ID you saw me get before, the client ID you saw me get, the client secret you saw me get, the workspace ID and report ID points to a specific report. And then I have this code here. Again, this is just boilerplate code, but what it does is it uses those values to get an access token. And then it uses that access token as well as the workspace ID and the report ID to generate a token, and then generate an embed URL, and then generate a report ID, and then it passes all those to that previous code. This right here is just drilling down to show you the actual call to get the access token, and then the report displays. Finally, again, this will not work with Fabric unless you do this one thing, which is in your Power BI report, you must use ODBC. That's the key. You can't just use, Fabric data source. It will not work if you're trying to use a Power BI embedded report. So in your Power BI report, you have to use ODBC configuration. On page 1 of the configuration, you need to go to the advanced, and you need to set the driver to ODBC driver 17 for SQL Server. You have to do that. And then you have to set the server to be equal to Fabric. Then the server is your Fabric's server TSQL connection. So that TSQL connection string we've been using previously, you put that here. This is how it's going to work. But then on page 2, that user ID is that service principal client ID that we're using before. The password is that password secret key that we're using before. And the authentication must be set to Active Directory Service Principal. If you do this, it'll work. Okay, so all the resources, the files, the tutorials, everything is available at blazerdata.net. So you'll see a walkthrough of everything I just showed you, as well as the links to download everything off of GitHub. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.